Tonight, we journey into the shadows, unraveling stories of terrifying encounters with entities from realms beyond. If you think you're brave enough, join us as we delve into accounts that defy logic and chill the soul. But beware! Each tale serves as a haunting reminder that some doors should remain closed. Title: Whispers of the Hammock. Laura's farmhouse stood at the edge of a small, sleepy town surrounded by acres of unbroken fields. The wind swept gently across the open land, brushing against the windows and carrying with it the distant hum of crickets. Inside, the house was dimly lit, its shadows stretching lazily across the old wooden floors. Laura was cradling her infant son, Ethan, in a hammock in the living room. The hammock, worn yet sturdy, had been passed down for generations in her family. It was her sanctuary, a tool she relied on to soothe Ethan during restless nights. "Just a few more minutes, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice soft yet heavy with fatigue. Her hand moved rhythmically, rocking the hammock back and forth. Ethan's eyes fluttered, and his tiny hands gripped the edge of his blanket. Laura's eyelids grew heavy as the soothing creak of the hammock filled the room. She hadn't had a full night's rest in months, and the exhaustion was taking its toll. The lullaby of the hammock's gentle swaying pulled Laura closer to the edge of sleep. She leaned against the wall next to the hammock, her hand still gripping its edge, her movements slowing. Before she realized it, her hand slipped, and she slumped onto the floor, the cool wood pressing against her cheek. The transition into her dream was seamless. She was in a familiar place, the same living room, but something was different. The air felt warmer, the colors more vibrant, and the shadows danced unnaturally across the walls. Laura looked up and saw her elder sister, Clara, sitting on the couch. Clara's presence was as vivid as it was unexpected. She wore a serene smile, her hands folded neatly on her lap. "Clara?" Laura's voice wavered. Clara nodded. "It's me, Laura. You look exhausted." Laura's throat tightened. Clara had died nearly a decade ago, long before Ethan was born. Yet, here she was, looking just as she had in life. Calm, comforting, and full of quiet wisdom. "You need to rest," Clara continued, her voice soft and steady. "I'll take over for a while. Go to sleep." The sound of the hammock's creaking brought Laura back to consciousness. She sat up abruptly, her heart pounding. The room was as it had been before, dimly lit and quiet except for one detail. The hammock was still moving. Her hand flew to her mouth as she stared at it. Ethan lay inside, sound asleep, the hammock swaying gently as if guided by invisible hands. Laura scrambled to her feet, gripping the hammock to stop its movement. Her fingers trembled as she touched the fabric. The room felt colder now, and the shadows seemed sharper. "It's just the wind," she muttered to herself, though the windows were closed and the air was still. She picked Ethan up and held him close, his warmth grounding her. "It's just my imagination," she whispered, but the seed of unease had been planted. The next morning, Laura tried to shake off the previous night's events. Over breakfast, she called her mother, seeking comfort in the familiarity of her voice. "Mom, do you think dreams can feel real?" Laura asked hesitantly. Her mother paused. "Dreams can be strange, Laura. They come from our thoughts and memories, and sometimes they can feel more vivid than they are. Why do you ask?" Laura hesitated. She didn't want to sound irrational. "No reason, just curious." Her mother chuckled. "You're just tired, sweetheart. Take care of yourself." But Laura couldn't ignore the unease that lingered. She found herself thinking about Clara, her older sister, who had been her protector and confidant before her untimely death. Clara had always been the strong one, the one who knew how to soothe fears and quiet doubts. The following nights were uneventful, but Laura couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It was subtle at first, a flicker of movement in the corner of her eye, a faint creak of the floorboards when the house was otherwise silent. One night, as she rocked Ethan to sleep, the air felt heavy. She glanced around the room, her eyes settling on the hammock. Seemed different. The fabric appeared more worn, the wood darker. A faint chill ran down her spine. She dismissed it as her imagination, but the feeling persisted. Laura decided to dig through some old family belongings, hoping to distract herself. In an old trunk, she found a photograph of Clara sitting in the very hammock now in Laura's living room. Clara was smiling, her hand resting on the edge of the hammock as if anchoring herself to it. Beneath the photograph was a letter written in Clara's handwriting. It was dated a few months before her death. "Dear Laura," it began, "if you're reading this, I hope it's because you've found something meaningful in my words. I've always believed that some things in life leave an imprint, on people, on places, and even on objects. The hammock has always felt like one of those things to me. It holds memories, both good and bad. Take care of it, and it will take care of you." Laura's breath hitched. She read the letter again, her eyes lingering on the last sentence. That night, Laura placed the photograph and letter on the coffee table in the living room. She sat beside the hammock, watching Ethan sleep. At midnight, a faint noise woke her. It was the sound of the hammock swaying, its creak steady and rhythmic. Laura froze. Her heart pounded as she stared at the hammock. Ethan was still asleep, but the hammock was moving again. Slowly, deliberately. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't leave Ethan. Instead, she reached out cautiously, gripping the edge of the hammock to stop its motion. The fabric felt unnaturally cold. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of the wind brushing against the windows. The following days were filled with a growing sense of dread. Laura tried to convince herself that everything had a logical explanation, but the incidents kept piling up. One evening, as she prepared to put Ethan to bed, she found the photograph of Clara moved to the floor, the frame cracked. The letter was gone. Her heart raced as she searched the room, but the letter was nowhere to be found. "Am I losing my mind?" she whispered, clutching Ethan tightly. But deep down, she knew the answer. Something or someone was trying to reach her. Laura's days were becoming a battle between rationality and creeping fear. She tried to keep her life as normal as possible, focusing on Ethan and their routine. Yet, her mind kept circling back to the hammock, Clara's letter, and the unsettling occurrences that seemed to revolve around them. She needed answers. Laura decided to visit her mother, who had always been the keeper of family stories and secrets. Packing Ethan's diaper bag, she drove to the outskirts of town where her mother lived in a modest house surrounded by rose bushes. Her mother, Margaret, greeted her with a warm smile. "You look tired, dear," she said, taking Ethan into her arms. "I haven't been sleeping well," Laura admitted, hesitating before adding, "Mom, do you remember anything unusual about Clara? Or the hammock?" Margaret's smile faltered. She glanced at Laura, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why do you ask?" Laura hesitated. "I've been having strange dreams, and I found a letter Clara wrote before she passed. She mentioned the hammock, how it held memories." Margaret's expression grew serious. She placed Ethan in his playpen and gestured for Laura to sit. "That hammock," Margaret began, "was a gift from your great-grandmother. She used to say it had been in the family for over a century. Clara loved it, but—" Margaret paused, as if choosing her words carefully. "She always said she felt a connection to it, almost like it had a life of its own." Margaret continued, "After Clara passed, I couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. I thought maybe it would bring comfort to someone else in the family. But if it's causing you trouble, maybe it's time to let it go." Laura's stomach churned. "It's not just the hammock, Mom. It's Clara. I feel like she's trying to tell me something." Margaret's face softened, but her voice remained steady. "Laura, grief can do strange things to our minds. Sometimes we see what we want to see, or what we fear the most." But Laura wasn't convinced. Her mother's words offered no solace, only more questions. On her way home, Laura decided to stop by the local antique shop to ask about the hammock. The shopkeeper, an elderly man named Walter, had a reputation for knowing the history behind heirlooms and antiques. Laura showed him a photograph of the hammock. Walter adjusted his glasses and examined it closely. This style is old, he said. Late 1800s, maybe early 1900s. Where did you get it? It's been in my family for generations, Laura replied. Do you think it could have any unusual properties? Walter chuckled, but there was no humor in it. Unusual properties? No. But objects like this, family pieces, they carry stories. Stories we don't always understand. Laura felt a chill. What kind of stories? Depends on who's telling them, Walter said cryptically. But sometimes the stories cling to the object, and sometimes the object clings back. Determined to find more information, Laura decided to go through Clara's old belongings, which were stored in her attic. The boxes were dusty, filled with faded photographs, old letters, and childhood memorabilia. Among them, she found a leather-bound journal. Clara's name was etched on the cover in neat handwriting. Laura opened it, her hands trembling. The entries were mundane at first, daily musings, plans for the future. But as she flipped through, the tone changed. July 15th. I had the dream again. The hammock was rocking by itself and I could hear whispers. I thought it was the wind, but it sounded too deliberate, too human. August 3rd. I don't know what's happening. I see shadows where there shouldn't be any. The hammock feels cold even on the warmest nights. September 10th. I think it wants something. Or someone. Laura's breath caught in her throat. She closed the journal and pressed it against her chest, her mind racing. What had Clara experienced and why was it starting to happen to her? That night, Laura placed the journal beside the hammock and sat down to read more. Ethan was asleep in his crib, and the house was eerily silent. As she read through the final entries, the air in the room grew colder. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she felt a presence. Something intangible yet undeniable. The hammock creaked. Laura froze, her eyes darting to it. It was moving again, swaying gently as if pushed by an unseen hand. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The hammock stopped. Laura's heart pounded as she stood and approached it cautiously. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the fabric. It was icy cold. "Clara?" she asked, her voice barely audible. The silence was deafening. The next day, Laura confided in her friend Sarah, a journalist known for her investigative skills. Sarah listened intently, her expression a mix of curiosity and concern. "Laura, this sounds serious," Sarah said. "If you think Clara's trying to communicate with you, we need to figure out why." Sarah suggested researching the family history, focusing on the hammock and its origins. They spent hours at the local library, poring over old records and newspaper archives. They found a small article dated 1902 about a woman named Evelyn Harper, Laura's great-grandmother. The article described Evelyn's tragic death, which occurred shortly after the birth of her child. The only detail that stood out was a mention of the hammock, described as her sanctuary during sleepless nights. Sarah pieced together a theory. What if the hammock represents more than just a piece of furniture? It seems tied to the women in your family, especially those with young children. Maybe it's a symbol of protection or something darker. Laura shuddered. The thought of Ethan being connected to this unnerved her. They decided to dig deeper, reaching out to distant relatives and uncovering more stories about the hammock. Each story had a common thread: unexplained phenomena, vivid dreams, and a sense of being watched. That night, Laura sat by the hammock, staring at it with a mix of fear and determination. She needed to confront whatever was happening, to put an end to the uncertainty and fear. "Clara," she said aloud, her voice steady. "If you're here, please tell me what you want." The room remained silent, but the hammock swayed slightly, as if in response. Laura's chest tightened. She wasn't sure if it was her imagination or something real, but she couldn't ignore it any longer. "I'll find out the truth," she whispered. "For you and for Ethan." The days after Laura's declaration were filled with an oppressive weight. The hammock remained motionless, a silent witness to her sleepless nights and anxious thoughts. Yet, Laura couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was watching her. Sarah continued her research, delving deeper into Laura's family history. The journals and letters they uncovered painted a troubling picture. Stories of grief-stricken women, unexplained deaths, and cryptic entries referencing the hammock. The common thread was clear, but the meaning remained elusive. One morning, Laura awoke to find Ethan crying in his crib. As she reached to comfort him, her hand brushed against the wooden rail, slick with moisture. She frowned, examining the crib. There was no sign of a leak, no explanation for the dampness. Ethan's cries grew louder, his tiny fists clenched as if warding off an unseen threat. Laura held him close, murmuring reassurances. The chill in the room seemed to seep into her skin, leaving her trembling. Determined to find clarity, Laura revisited Clara's journal. This time, she examined every detail, searching for a clue she might have missed. Near the back of the journal, she found a folded sheet of paper. It was yellowed with age, the handwriting faint but legible. If you feel the cold, it means it's near. Don't let it in. Don't let it take him. The note was unsigned, but Laura recognized Clara's handwriting. Her heart raced as she reread the words. The warnings seemed urgent, almost desperate. But what did Clara mean by it? And who was him? Laura's thoughts turned to Ethan. The idea that her son might be in danger sent a surge of protective resolve through her. She decided to consult someone who might provide answers. A retired historian named Richard Calloway, who had helped Sarah with her research in the past. Richard's home was a cluttered maze of books and artifacts, the air thick with the scent of aged paper. He greeted Laura and Sarah warmly, his curiosity piqued by their questions. As Laura explained her situation, Richard's expression grew grave. "I've come across stories like this before," he said, pulling a leather-bound volume from his shelf. Family heirlooms, particularly those passed down for generations, often carry more than sentimental value. They can become vessels for memory, emotion, sometimes even trauma. He flipped to a bookmarked page and handed the book to Laura. The passage detailed a phenomenon known as psychogenic resonance, where intense emotions or events imprint themselves on objects. "Are you saying the hammock is haunted?" Laura asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard shook his head. "Not haunted, necessarily, but it might carry the echoes of those who used it. If Clara felt a strong connection to it, her emotions could have left a lasting imprint." Laura's mind swirled with possibilities. Could Clara's warnings be tied to her own unresolved feelings? Or was there something more sinister at play? That night, Laura decided to confront the hammock directly. She placed it in the center of the living room and sat across from it, the journal and note by her side. The house was eerily quiet, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. Laura stared at the hammock, her thoughts a chaotic mix of fear and determination. Hours passed, and nothing happened. Just as she began to question her resolve, a faint creak broke the silence. The hammock swayed gently, the motion subtle but unmistakable. Laura's breath caught. "Clara?" she whispered. The room grew colder, the air thick with an indescribable tension. The hammock's movements became more pronounced, as if responding to her voice. "Tell me what you want," Laura said, her voice trembling. "Tell me how to help you." The hammock stopped abruptly, its stillness more unsettling than its motion. Laura waited, her heart pounding, but no answer came. The next morning, Laura awoke to find a single word scrawled on the wall above the hammock. "Protect." The letters were faint, as if written in dust, but their message was clear. Laura's resolve hardened. Whatever was happening, she would not let it harm Ethan. She contacted Sarah and Richard, asking them to help her uncover the final piece of the puzzle. They spent the day combing through more records, piecing together the history of the hammock and its connection to Laura's family. They discovered that Evelyn Harper, Laura's great-grandmother, had suffered a tragic loss. Her infant son had died under mysterious circumstances. Evelyn had been found days later, sitting in the hammock, clutching a blanket and murmuring incoherently. The family had attributed her behavior to grief, but the parallels to Laura's experiences were impossible to ignore. That evening, Laura decided to end the cycle. She set the hammock ablaze in the backyard, watching as the flames consumed the fabric and wood. As the fire burned, Laura felt a strange mix of relief and sorrow. She hoped that by destroying the hammock, she was freeing her family from its grip. But as the last embers died out, Laura's sense of peace was shattered. In the shadows beyond the firelight, she saw a figure, tall and indistinct, its outline flickering like the remnants of a dream. Laura blinked, and the figure was gone. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences ceased. The house felt lighter, the oppressive atmosphere replaced by a sense of calm. Laura threw herself into caring for Ethan, determined to give him a life free from fear. She kept Clara's journal, a reminder of the strength and resilience that had carried her through. Yet, in the quiet moments, Laura couldn't help but wonder. Had she truly ended the cycle or merely delayed it? One night, as she rocked Ethan to sleep, she felt a faint chill in the air. Glancing at the empty corner where the hammock once stood, she thought she saw a shadow move. Laura shook her head, dismissing the thought. But deep down, she knew the past had a way of lingering, its echoes waiting for the right moment to return.